You'll never recover without me.
You may not know everything. I wasn't aware of this. You weren't supposed to be.
That's him? It went national this morning.
George White was 42, a quiet senior operations executive in Chicago who drove an aging Honda Accord and wore the same navy suit until the cuffs began to fade. Most people believed his wife, Chloe White, had simply outgrown him. They whispered that once the divorce was over, he would disappear into an ordinary life. No one would notice. What they didn't know was that George had spent years building something too valuable to mention, and contracts had kept him silent. Chloe signed the final page, slid the papers across the table, and said, "You'll never recover without me." George lowered his eyes to the signature as his phone vibrated once inside his jacket pocket. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I'm always curious to see where these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow burn stories filled with quiet twists, hidden truths, and satisfying endings, subscribe now so you won't miss tomorrow's story. 18 months earlier, nothing about George White suggested that his life was quietly moving toward a turning point. Every weekday began the same way. His alarm rang at 5:20 a.m. in a modest brick house in Naperville, a western suburb of Chicago. Before the sun reached the rooftops, he had already made coffee-packed Liam's lunch and reviewed production reports on his aging laptop, while the kitchen remained silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Routine gave him clarity. He believed that if the first hour of the morning stayed organized, the rest of the day usually followed. At 6 o'clock, Liam wandered downstairs wearing a wrinkled hoodie, still half asleep. "Morning, Dad." "Morning." George slid a plate of scrambled eggs toward him without another word. Neither of them liked unnecessary conversation before school. The quiet never felt awkward. It felt earned. Across the hallway, Chloe walked downstairs 20 minutes later, dressed for a luxury property showing in downtown Chicago. Her cream-colored blazer looked new. Her designer handbag rested perfectly on her shoulder before she even reached the front door. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror twice. "Don't forget," she said while fastening a diamond bracelet. "The Langfords are hosting dinner Friday." George looked up from his coffee. "I may still be at the office." "You always are." There was no anger in her voice anymore, only disappointment. Months earlier, they would have argued. Now they simply accepted that neither expected the other to change. George nodded once. "I'll try." She smiled politely. "We both know what that means." The front door closed softly behind her. George stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching her white Range Rover disappear down and down the street. Then he turned toward Liam. "Ready?" Liam shrugged. "As ready as algebra allows." George smiled. The drive to school lasted 15 minutes. The drive to his office took another 40. His workplace wasn't glamorous. Midwest Integrated Manufacturing occupied 4 gray office buildings beside Interstate 290. The headquarters overlooked rail lines instead of skylines. Visitors rarely photographed the entrance. Inside, however, millions of dollars moved through spreadsheets every hour. George wasn't the CEO. He wasn't even a vice president. His title read Senior Operations Executive. Most people outside the company would have assumed that meant middle management. Inside the building, whenever something went wrong, people looked for George. At 8:14 a.m., his phone rang before he reached his desk. "George, this is Carla in Detroit." "I know." "We've got a problem." He already expected one. Factories rarely called early to share good news. "Our brake assembly supplier just shut down." "How long?" "No one knows." George opened 3 dashboards simultaneously. Inventory, transportation, regional production. No panic, only numbers. Within 90 seconds, he had identified 4 alternate suppliers across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri. Another 3 minutes produced revised transportation routes. 10 minutes later, he called Carla back. "You'll lose today's afternoon shift," she sighed. "I figured. But tomorrow morning everything resumes." Silence. "How?" "I'll email the routing plan." 20 minutes later, 6 manufacturing plants avoided shutting down. Estimated savings $4.8 million. Nobody applauded. Nobody announced his name during company meetings. Another crisis simply disappeared before anyone outside operations realized it existed. George preferred it that way. His satisfaction never came from attention. It came from solving problems cleanly. Around noon, he ate lunch alone at the same picnic table behind the warehouse. Turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee. No restaurant, no networking lunch, no expensive steakhouse. One younger employee sat beside him. "You know," the man laughed, "if I saved the company millions every week, I'd ask for a bigger office." George smiled. "Bigger offices don't solve production delays." The younger employee laughed again. George returned to reading freight reports. That afternoon, Chloe posted photographs online from a rooftop charity fundraiser overlooking Lake Michigan. Crystal chandeliers, champagne glasses, luxury condos, smiling investors. The comments filled quickly. Beautiful. Power couple. Living the dream. George never saw the post. He had disabled social media notifications years earlier. At 5:30, he finally left the office. Instead of driving home immediately, he stopped at a youth baseball field where Liam practiced every Tuesday. Parents gathered along the fence carrying expensive folding chairs. George leaned quietly against the chain-link fence. He never shouted instructions, never criticized mistakes. Every few innings, Liam glanced toward him. His father always nodded once. That was enough. After practice, they stopped at a small burger restaurant that had served the neighborhood for nearly 30 years. Nothing fancy. Red vinyl booths, old photographs of Chicago sports teams covering the walls. The waitress already knew their order. "The usual?" George nodded. Liam smiled. "You should own stock here." "I probably should." They laughed. Simple evenings like this had once included Chloe. Now she was almost always attending networking dinners, client receptions, or luxury property launches. George understood why. Her career depended on relationships. Still, something had changed. Not suddenly, gradually. She no longer talked about helping families find homes. She talked about commissions, recognition, luxury brands, magazine features. The conversation sounded different. At home, later that evening, Chloe returned just after 9. Her heels echoed across the hardwood floor. George was helping Liam finish a science project at the dining table. "You missed dinner," Liam said. "I had clients." She kissed the top of his head. "Sorry, sweetheart." George collected the empty glue sticks. "Everything go well?" It was incredible. She opened her phone immediately. You should have seen the penthouse. George listened quietly while placing school supplies back into a drawer. 7,000 square feet. She continued scrolling through photographs. Private rooftop pool. Another picture. Wine cellar. Another. The buyers flew in from Miami. George smiled politely. "Sounds impressive." She looked at him. "That's all." "What else?" "I don't know." "Congratulations." He meant it sincerely. She nodded. "Thanks." But the room stayed strangely quiet afterward. George noticed how often their conversations now ended after only a few exchanges. Not because they disliked each other, because they no longer occupied the same world. Before going upstairs, Chloe paused. "Daniel and Melissa invited us to Aspen in February." George checked his calendar mentally. "I probably can't." "You haven't even looked." "I already know the production schedule." She folded her arms. "George, our first quarter supplier transition starts that week. You always have another transition." He didn't answer. Because she wasn't entirely wrong. His work always seemed to demand something. What she didn't understand was why. She believed he stayed late because he lacked influence. The truth was exactly the opposite. He stayed because too many companies depended on decisions no one else knew how to make. Near midnight, George sat alone in the living room reviewing logistics reports one final time. The house had become silent again. Then he heard footsteps upstairs. A soft vibration. Another. Not from his phone. From Chloe's. She had forgotten it on the kitchen island. The screen illuminated briefly. A message preview appeared before fading. Looking forward to tomorrow night. D. George wasn't the kind of man who searched through another person's phone. He didn't touch it. He simply looked away. A second message arrived less than 30 seconds later. Don't tell him yet. George slowly closed his laptop. He stared through the dark kitchen window, where his own reflection looked older than 42. He felt no burst of anger, no dramatic rush toward confrontation, only an unfamiliar weight settling quietly in his chest. Years of solving impossible business problems had taught him one lesson above all others. The first explanation was rarely the correct one. Facts came before conclusions. Emotions came later. He switched off the kitchen light, carried his laptop upstairs, and said nothing. But for the first time in many years, George realized he was no longer trying to understand supply chains. He was trying to understand his own marriage. George slept less than 4 hours that night, not because of the 2 messages he had seen on Chloe's forgotten phone, because they reminded him how much of his own life existed beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. At 6:30 the next morning, he arrived at Midwest Integrated Manufacturing exactly on schedule. The building looked the same as it had the previous day. Delivery trucks lined the loading docks. Forklifts crossed the warehouse floor. Engineers hurried through the front entrance balancing coffee cups and laptops. Nothing suggested that another version of George's career existed somewhere beyond those walls. Only one man in the building knew. Andrew Collins. At precisely 7:00 a.m., George walked into an empty conference room and connected his laptop to a secure video call. The screen remained black for several seconds before Andrew appeared. His office overlooked downtown Austin, Texas. Unlike George, Andrew enjoyed visibility. He regularly spoke at technology conferences. His interviews appeared in trade magazines. His photograph occasionally surfaced in manufacturing journals. People assumed Andrew had built Apex Flow Technologies alone. Andrew himself never accepted that version of the story. "You look tired," he said. George smiled faintly. "I've had busier mornings." Andrew leaned back. "I reviewed yesterday's simulation. And we reduced average shipping delays another 11%. George nodded. "Good." "No," Andrew corrected him. "Exceptional." George reached for his notebook. "Let's review the Detroit routing." Andrew laughed. "You know what I admire most about you?" George didn't answer. "You never celebrate." "The work isn't finished." Andrew shook his head. "That's exactly my point." The meeting lasted nearly 90 minutes. No investors attended. No executives applauded. No assistants took photographs. Only 2 men examined thousands of supply chain variables that would eventually save manufacturers hundreds of millions of dollars. They discussed warehouse automation in Ohio, rail congestion outside Kansas City, container shortages near Savannah, machine learning models predicting component failures weeks before they occurred. The conversation sounded almost painfully ordinary. Yet every improvement increased Apex Flow's value. Every solution quietly strengthened the company George partially owned. Except almost nobody knew he owned anything. 5 years earlier, Andrew had approached George after a logistics conference in Indianapolis. At the time, Andrew possessed extraordinary technical talent, but almost no operational experience. George possessed the opposite. He understood factories. He understood production managers. He understood why elegant software often failed inside real manufacturing plants. Andrew had asked one question over dinner. If you could redesign the entire supply chain from scratch, what would you change first? George had answered without hesitation. I'd stop optimizing warehouses. Andrew frowned. What would you optimize? The decisions people make before products ever reach warehouses. Andrew stared at him for nearly a minute. Most consultants sold software. George sold understanding. That conversation became the foundation of Apex Flow. The company never hired George full-time. Instead, he continued working his regular corporate position while quietly designing the decision architecture behind Apex Flow's predictive logistics platform. His compensation looked strange. Smaller salary, almost no bonuses, ownership equity. At the time, many people would have called it a terrible financial decision. George called it patience. The contracts were unusually strict. Every line of software, every operational model, every client negotiation, every future ownership percentage, protected by confidentiality agreements. Violating them would have destroyed years of work. Andrew often joked that George kept more secrets than government agencies. George never laughed. To him, agreements were promises. Promises deserved protection. Back in Chicago, his normal workday continued exactly as expected. By lunchtime, he had resolved another supplier delay involving precision bearings arriving from Indiana. His manager stopped outside his office. Nice work. George looked up. Thanks. Saved us again. It was a team effort. His manager smiled. You always say that. Because it was true. George disliked people who treated success like personal property. Nothing meaningful happened alone. That evening he drove home through slow traffic along Interstate 88. Rain covered the windshield. Local radio reported another rise in housing prices across suburban Chicago. The announcer interviewed one of the city's fastest-growing luxury real estate agents, Chloe White. George listened quietly. Her voice sounded confident, professional. She described changing buyer expectations, high-net-worth migration, luxury inventory. The interviewer asked whether success required ambition. It requires believing you deserve more, Chloe answered. George switched the radio off. Not because he disagreed, because he wondered when more had quietly become the center of every conversation. When he arrived home, Chloe was already dressed for another client dinner. You're late, she said. Traffic. I'll be home around 11. George nodded. Liam already finished his homework. Good. She reached for her keys, then paused. Andrew called again? George looked toward her. He emails sometimes. I've never met him. He lives in Texas. You seem to spend a lot of evenings working with him. George answered honestly. We're building something. She smiled politely. What exactly? He looked at the floor for a second. The question sounded simple. The answer could not be. I can't explain yet. She laughed softly. That's what you always say. It isn't because I don't trust you. Then why? The contracts. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. George, I signed them. You've been saying that for years. I know. She crossed her arms. Do you honestly expect me to believe some secret project is going to change our lives? George didn't respond immediately, because he had asked himself the same question many times. Startups failed every day. Brilliant ideas disappeared constantly. Nothing was guaranteed. I expect you to believe I wouldn't lie to you. Silence settled between them. She looked toward the hallway. I don't think you're lying. He waited. I think you're dreaming. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. George felt them anyway. She picked up her handbag. I'll see you later. The front door closed. George remained standing in the kitchen. He replayed the conversation carefully, not searching for an argument. searching for the exact moment they had stopped believing in each other's future. Upstairs, Liam called down. "Dad? I'm here." "Can you help me study?" George climbed the stairs immediately. For the next hour, they reviewed American history, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, checks and balances. Liam frowned over one question. "Why are there so many rules?" George smiled. "So people can't make decisions based only on emotions." Liam nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." George quietly wondered why adults often forgot lessons taught to 14-year-olds. Near midnight, after Liam had gone to sleep, George opened another encrypted meeting invitation from Andrew. Attached was a revised ownership agreement. No signatures yet, only one note. "The final legal restructuring is almost complete. One more milestone." George stared at the document. 5 years of invisible work, thousands of late nights, countless flights taken without photographs, endless weekends solving problems inside anonymous conference rooms. None of it had changed how the outside world viewed him. To neighbors, he remained an ordinary operations executive. To Chloe's friends, he was the quiet husband who never seemed to move ahead. To luxury real estate agents at Chloe's networking events, he barely existed. George closed the document without signing. Timing mattered. The attorneys had explained that the restructuring had to be completed in exactly the right sequence. One premature signature could trigger tax consequences worth millions. Patience had protected the company this far. Patience would finish the journey. His phone rang. "Andrew again." George answered. "It's late." "I know," Andrew said. "I've got news." George waited. "The board approved the final ownership structure." George remained silent. "The lawyers just need one last clearance." "Well, how long?" "A few weeks." George looked through the window into the dark backyard. Rain still fell softly across the wooden fence. "So we're almost there." Andrew laughed quietly. "No, we're finally there." George didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment. Years of discipline had taught him never to celebrate before the ink dried. Still, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself one private thought. Maybe everything he had quietly built was about to become impossible to hide. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. George found it tucked neatly between utility bills and grocery coupons inside the black mailbox at the end of the driveway. A plain white envelope. No return logo. Only his name printed in clean block letters. George White. He recognized the law firm's address before he reached the front porch. He stood there for several seconds without opening it. Inside the house, Liam was finishing homework at the dining room table while the evening news played softly from the television. "Dad, I'm coming." George placed the envelope beside his laptop. Dinner came first. Paperwork could wait another hour. It always surprised people that George separated urgency from importance. Not every urgent matter deserved immediate attention. Some deserved a clear mind instead. After Liam went upstairs to shower, George finally opened the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County, petitioner Chloe White. He read every page slowly. No visible emotion crossed his face. The document described an irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, division of marital assets, child custody, financial disclosures, requests for temporary support, professional language, cold, efficient, final. George finished reading before folding every page back into its original order. He didn't throw anything onto the table. He didn't pace across the room. He simply reached for a yellow legal pad and began writing dates. Marriage, mortgage, Liam's birth, home purchase, retirement accounts, tax returns. Years spent together reduced to organized timelines. At 8:47 p.m., Chloe walked through the front door carrying 2 garment bags from an upscale boutique. She immediately noticed the envelope. "So," George looked toward her. "It came." "Yes." Neither raised their voice. Neither pretended surprise. She slowly placed the garment bags beside the stairs. I wasn't sure when they'd serve you. They did. Silence lingered. Finally, Chloe spoke. I don't want this to become ugly. George nodded. Neither do I. I think we can handle this like adults. I agree. She seemed relieved. I've hired Benjamin Carter. George recognized the name immediately, one of Chicago's most aggressive divorce attorneys. Expensive, highly successful, frequently interviewed by local legal media. George simply nodded. He has a good reputation. He does. She hesitated. I hope you'll hire someone too. I will. Again, silence. No accusations, no tears, no dramatic speeches, only two people acknowledging that years together had reached their final chapter. That night, George slept in the guest room, not because anyone demanded it, because practical decisions often prevented unnecessary conflict. The following morning, he called one person before driving to work, his older sister, Rebecca. She answered on the second ring. George, I got served. Her voice softened immediately. I'm sorry. So am I. What are you going to do? Hire an attorney. Good. I'll handle it. I know you will. She paused. Promise me one thing. What? Don't try handling this alone. George smiled faintly. I wasn't planning to. At the office, almost nobody noticed anything different. George attended the same operations meeting, reviewed transportation forecasts, resolved another supplier shortage in Wisconsin, answered 37 emails before lunch. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, he knew every decision from this day forward mattered. That afternoon, he began researching attorneys, not advertisements, not television commercials, court records, professional histories, appeal outcomes, judicial opinions. He looked for patterns instead of promises. One name repeatedly appeared beside successful settlements, supported by documentation rather than emotional arguments. Emily Parker. Her office occupied the 23rd floor of a downtown Chicago building overlooking the Chicago River. 2 days later, George sat across from her. The office reflected its owner. Simple, organized. No oversized furniture, no expensive artwork, no attempt to impress visitors. Emily entered carrying only one legal folder. She shook George's hand. I've reviewed the petition. George nodded. What do you think? I think you've done something unusual. What? You haven't answered it emotionally. George smiled slightly. I figured that wouldn't help. It never does. She opened the folder. Tell me about your finances. George spent nearly 40 minutes explaining everything. Salary, retirement accounts, mortgage, college savings, household expenses, his confidential work with Andrew, the ownership agreements he still couldn't legally disclose in detail. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back. I have one question. Go ahead. Have you hidden any assets? No. Not even unintentionally. No. She watched him for another moment. I believe you. George appreciated that she didn't say it casually. Attorneys rarely believed first impressions. What happens now? He asked. Emily slid a blank notebook across the desk. Starting today, you document everything. 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 She began listing items. Every bank statement, every credit card transaction, every mortgage payment, every tax return, every email, every text message, every insurance policy, every investment statement, every household expense, every calendar entry. George wrote continuously. Then Emily stopped. This next part is more important. George looked up. You do not argue. He nodded. You do not defend your reputation. Another nod. You do not respond to insults. He remained silent. You do not assume fairness. George finally spoke. I understand. Emily folded her hands. Family court isn't about who feels more hurt. It's about evidence. Exactly. She smiled for the first time. And evidence ages well. As George prepared to leave, Emily asked one final question. Do you trust your memory? Usually. Don't. He looked surprised. Our memories change. She tapped the notebook. Documents don't. Driving home through downtown traffic, George replayed the meeting. Emily reminded him of the engineers he respected most. Precise, measured, unimpressed by emotion. That evening, Chloe informed him she would temporarily stay in a downtown condominium owned by one of her clients until the legal process moved forward. I think it'll be easier. George nodded. Liam? He should stay here. George appreciated that answer. So do I. Within an hour, she packed 2 large suitcases, designer dresses, shoes, cosmetics, laptop. She paused near the front door. I never wanted us to hate each other. George looked directly at her. I don't hate you. She seemed almost surprised. I know. Then she left. The house immediately felt larger. Not quieter, just emptier. Over the next 3 weeks, George built routines around legal preparation. Every evening after work, he scanned financial documents into organized digital folders: mortgage, utilities, medical expenses, education, taxes, insurance. Emily requested everything. He provided everything, sometimes until 1 o'clock in the morning. Liam occasionally walked downstairs for water and found his father surrounded by paperwork. You still working? George smiled. Different kind of work. Need help? You've got school. Liam shrugged. I can sort papers. George laughed softly. Maybe tomorrow. One Saturday afternoon, Emily called unexpectedly. I've been reviewing your financial timeline. George immediately opened his notebook. What did you find? Not enough. What do you mean? There's a gap. George frowned. What kind of gap? Large household expenditures. He thought for several seconds. I'll review everything again. Good. Anything specific? I need every payment connected to the last 3 years. I have them. I don't think you do. George remained quiet. Emily continued. I've compared tax records with account balances. And something doesn't reconcile. George walked toward the filing cabinet in his home office. What exactly is missing? I don't know yet. She paused before speaking again. But I think someone assumed nobody would ever compare every document in chronological order. George slowly opened the lowest drawer of the cabinet. Inside sat years of neatly labeled folders, receipts, statements, canceled checks, warranty documents, old loan agreements. He suddenly remembered one small storage box he hadn't opened in years. The box contained miscellaneous financial paperwork from before they digitized most records. George lifted it onto the desk. Dust covered the lid. Emily spoke quietly through the phone. Don't rush. I'm looking. Sometimes the smallest document changes the entire case. George removed the lid. Hundreds of old papers waited inside. Near the bottom rested a sealed bank envelope he didn't remember saving. He stared at it for several seconds without opening it. For the first time since the divorce began, George had the unmistakable feeling that the paperwork in front of him might contain something neither side had expected to find. George did not open the old bank envelope immediately. Instead, he placed it on his desk and continued sorting every remaining document inside the storage box. That was how he had solved complex problems for nearly 20 years. Never assume the answer announces itself first. By midnight, the desk had disappeared beneath carefully arranged stacks. Property tax records, old insurance renewals, medical invoices, warranty registrations, mortgage correspondence, receipts from grocery stores that no longer existed. Most people would have considered the papers worthless. George knew otherwise. Every document represented a moment in time. Moments built timelines. Timelines revealed truth. At exactly 12:18 a.m., he finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside were 3 folded pages. The first was an annual bank summary. The second listed wire transfers from nearly 3 years earlier. The third immediately caught his attention. A cashier's check. $48,000. George stared at it for several seconds. He remembered approving the withdrawal. He had believed the money was used for renovations on Chloe's luxury real estate office after she explained the business needed temporary cash flow before closing several commissions. He clearly remembered the conversation. What he did not remember was where the money had ultimately gone. He opened his laptop. Within minutes, he located matching withdrawals inside their digital banking history. The money had indeed left the account, but the destination account number listed on the cashier's check was unfamiliar. George frowned. He opened another spreadsheet, then another, then another. At 1:30 in the morning, he stopped. Not because he had finished, because guessing would accomplish nothing. He photographed every page and emailed them to Emily Parker with one sentence. "I think these belong in the timeline," Emily replied before 8 the next morning. "Do not discuss these documents with anyone. Bring every original to my office." George drove downtown after work. Emily had already covered one wall with printed timelines connected by colored notes. Blue represented household income. Green represented verified expenses. Yellow represented unresolved transactions. Red represented unexplained movements. She took the cashier's check without speaking. Then she compared it against several folders already open across the conference table. 5 minutes passed. Neither spoke. Finally, Emily looked up. "Interesting." George waited. "This wasn't deposited where it should have been." "What do you mean?" "If this money financed Chloe's business expansion, there should be supporting business records." "There aren't. I haven't found any." George remained quiet. Emily appreciated clients who understood silence. Lawyers often thought more clearly without interruption. She circled one account number. "Have you ever seen this bank?" George leaned closer. "No." "Neither have I." She made another note. "We'll subpoena records if necessary." George nodded. "What should I do?" "The same thing you've been doing. Document everything." "Exactly." She slid another folder toward him. "I also want every credit card statement." "You already have them." "I have copies." She smiled slightly. "I want originals." George understood. Original documents carried weight. Copies invited questions. Over the following 2 weeks, George developed a second full-time job. His mornings belonged to manufacturing operations. His evenings belonged to legal preparation. His weekends belonged to Liam. Saturday mornings remained sacred. Regardless of court dates, attorney meetings, or confidential conference calls with Andrew Collins, George never canceled breakfast with his son. They always visited the same small diner on Ogden Avenue. Same booth, same waitress, same order. French toast for Liam. Vegetable omelet for George. One Saturday, Liam looked unusually thoughtful. "Dad?" George looked up from his coffee. "Yeah? Did Mom leave because of me?" The question arrived quietly, almost carefully. George immediately put down his fork. "No." "You promise?" "I do." Liam looked toward the window. "Then why?" George considered the answer, not because he wanted to protect Chloe, because children deserved honesty without carrying adult burdens. Sometimes people stop seeing the future the same way. Liam frowned. "I don't understand." "You don't have to." George smiled gently. "What matters is this." "What?" "You still have 2 parents." Liam nodded slowly. "We both love you." That answer seemed enough. For now. Later that afternoon, George returned home and found 3 large storage containers waiting in the garage. They belonged to Chloe. She had sent movers earlier that day. Each container held clothing, decorative pieces, framed photographs, and office materials. Nothing emotional, only possessions. George carried everything into the guest room exactly as listed on the inventory sheet. No missing items, no damaged boxes. Emily had repeatedly reminded him. Document every exchange. At 6 o'clock, his phone rang. Andrew Collins. "You've disappeared." George laughed quietly. "Family court." Ouch. "Pretty much." Andrew hesitated. "You okay?" George looked around the empty kitchen. "I'm busy." "That's not what I asked." George thought for a moment. "I'll be fine." Andrew accepted the answer. "I've got company news." George leaned against the counter. "Tell me." "We're entering final negotiations with Titan Manufacturing." George knew the name immediately. Titan operated facilities across 12 states. Landing that contract would permanently change Apex Flow's future. "How's it looking?" "They're impressed." "Any concerns?" "Only one." George waited. "They want operational guarantees." George smiled faintly. "Reasonable." "I told them nobody understands operational guarantees better than you." George shook his head. "Don't oversell me." Andrew laughed. "You still don't understand your own reputation." After ending the call, George sat quietly for several minutes. Titan Manufacturing represented years of effort, years of invisible meetings, years of flights nobody knew about, years of weekends quietly sacrificed, yet none of it could be discussed publicly. Not with co-workers, not with neighbors, not even with Chloe while they were married. Sometimes he wondered whether secrecy itself had slowly widened the distance between them. Then he reminded himself of another truth. Promises remained promises even when they became difficult. Monday morning brought another legal meeting. Emily looked unusually satisfied. "I received preliminary banking records." George noticed several new folders stacked neatly across her desk. "What did they show?" "They showed movement." She opened one file. The $48,000 wasn't the only unusual transfer. George leaned forward. There were others. Several. She handed him a printed spreadsheet, dozens of highlighted transactions stretched across 3 years. Some were small, others exceeded $10,000. "What am I looking at?" George asked. Emily answered carefully. "Money leaving joint accounts. I approved most household expenses." "I know." She tapped one column. "These don't match household expenses." George studied the dates. Many coincided with weekends Chloe claimed to be attending luxury real estate conferences. Others occurred during business trips. Still others happened only days before large credit card balances mysteriously disappeared. Emily folded her hands. "I'm not accusing anyone." George appreciated that. "We're establishing facts." "Exactly," she continued. "Family court doesn't reward assumptions." George nodded. "It rewards evidence." Emily smiled. "You're learning?" For another hour, they organized financial timelines. No speculation, only documentation. When they finished, Emily placed every page into a thick binder. Then she closed it firmly. "I want you prepared for something." "What?" "Benjamin Carter is excellent." George already knew that. "He'll attempt to control the story." "I expected that." "He'll describe you as financially average." George almost smiled. "He isn't wrong." Emily looked directly into his eyes. "Average isn't weakness." George remained silent. She continued. "Remember that." Driving home, George replayed her words. Average isn't weakness. For years he had lived exactly that way. Ordinary car, ordinary clothes, ordinary office, invisible success. Perhaps people simply believed what appearances allowed them to believe. That evening, Liam was already asleep when George walked into his home office. His laptop displayed another encrypted email from Apex Flow's legal department. Subject: Final Equity Conversion Schedule. George read every page twice. Everything was progressing exactly as planned. The ownership conversion would become legally effective soon. Very soon. He closed the laptop without responding. Then his eyes drifted toward Emily's growing stack of evidence binders arranged neatly across the bookshelf. One collection documented his marriage, the other documented his future. Both depended on the same principle. Truth required patience before it revealed its full value. And somewhere beyond the courtroom, beyond the financial records, and beyond the confidential contracts events were moving toward a collision that none of the people surrounding George could yet imagine. The first courtroom hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. George arrived 35 minutes early. Not because Emily Parker had asked him to, because punctuality gave him time to observe. Cook County Domestic Relations Courthouse was already crowded. Couples sat quietly on wooden benches outside courtrooms, some avoiding eye contact, others speaking in low voices with attorneys carrying thick binders. George carried only a black leather portfolio. Every document inside had been arranged exactly as Emily preferred, chronologically, nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. Emily met him near the security checkpoint. "You slept?" she asked. "Enough." "You nervous?" "No." She studied him for a second. "I believe you." George looked toward the courtroom doors. "What should I expect? The first hearing isn't about winning. It's about positioning." He nodded. Emily continued. "Benjamin Carter knows that. So he'll perform." "Exactly." She handed George a printed schedule. "Remember, I answer only what's asked." "Yes." "I don't volunteer information." "Correct." "I don't argue." Emily smiled. "I wish every client learned this quickly." At 8:55 a.m., Chloe entered the hallway. She wore an elegant charcoal business suit paired with understated jewelry and carried herself with the confidence that had become natural over years of working with wealthy clients. Benjamin Carter walked beside her. Tall, perfectly tailored navy suit, silver tie, confident smile. He greeted nearly everyone in the hallway by name. Court clerks, security officers, other attorneys. His reputation clearly preceded him. Benjamin noticed George immediately. He crossed the hallway. "Mr. White." George extended his hand. "Mr. Carter." Benjamin smiled warmly. "I hope we can keep this professional." "So do I." Benjamin glanced briefly toward Emily. "I'm sure we all want an efficient resolution," Emily answered calmly. "Efficiency depends on accuracy." Benjamin laughed politely. "Of course." Then he walked away. George watched him disappear into the courtroom. Emily leaned closer. "He wants everyone relaxed." George looked toward her. "Why?" "So they underestimate him." George nodded once. "He won't." Courtroom 4B opened promptly at 9. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered exactly 3 minutes later. Everyone stood. She was 62, composed, and entirely uninterested in theatrical presentations. George noticed something immediately. She spent more time reading files than looking at attorneys. That reassured him. Benjamin spoke first. His presentation sounded polished, controlled, confident. He described Chloe as an accomplished real estate professional whose career had continued advancing while carrying increasing financial responsibility for the household. Then he described George, a middle management operations employee with stable but limited earning potential. George showed no reaction. Benjamin continued, "There are no extraordinary business holdings presently available for valuation." Emily quietly made one note. Nothing more. Benjamin discussed temporary financial arrangements, child scheduling, property access, routine procedural matters. Every sentence subtly reinforced the same image. George White was ordinary, financially predictable, comfortably middle class, no hidden complexity, no unusual future prospects. Exactly the story Benjamin wanted the court to remember. Judge Sullivan looked toward George. Mr. White. Yes, Your Honor. You've reviewed the petition. I have. Any objections to today's procedural schedule? No, Your Honor. She nodded. Thank you. Benjamin resumed speaking. He referenced salary statements, mortgage obligations, retirement estimates. George noticed how carefully Benjamin avoided exaggeration. That made him dangerous. Everything sounded reasonable, even when incomplete. Emily finally stood. Her voice remained almost conversational. Your Honor, we have no objection to establishing temporary procedures. Judge Sullivan looked up. Very well. Emily continued. However, we request additional time for comprehensive financial discovery. Benjamin responded immediately. Counsel already possesses standard disclosures. Emily nodded politely. We do? Then why additional discovery? Emily answered without raising her voice. Because complete documentation benefits everyone. Judge Sullivan looked towards Benjamin. Any objection? Benjamin smiled. Not if it's limited. Emily spoke again. We're simply requesting complete banking records, financial transfers, and supporting documentation. Benjamin hesitated for the first time, only briefly, then smiled again. No objection. George noticed Emily writing another note. One word. Interesting. The hearing continued. Routine procedural questions followed. Temporary parenting schedules. Exchange logistics. Deadlines for financial disclosures. Then Judge Sullivan addressed George directly. Mr. White. Yes, Your Honor. Your employment. Senior Operations Executive. How long? Nearly 12 years. Current annual salary, George answered accurately. Benjamin looked satisfied. Everything reinforced his narrative. Stable employee, predictable income, nothing remarkable. Judge Sullivan reviewed another page. Any additional business interests? George glanced briefly toward Emily. She gave the smallest possible nod. George answered carefully. I have contractual interests that remain subject to confidentiality agreements. Benjamin immediately stood. Your Honor, unless those interests presently generate disclosed income, Emily interrupted. We are not discussing valuation today. Judge Sullivan raised one hand. Counsel. Silence returned instantly. She looked directly at George. Mr. White. Yes. Are those agreements legally binding? They are. Can documentation be provided under appropriate protective orders if necessary? Yes. Judge Sullivan nodded. Very well. Benjamin sat down without another word. George noticed something unusual. For the first time that morning, Judge Sullivan underlined a sentence inside George's file. Only one. Confidential contractual interests. The hearing recessed briefly before addressing temporary parenting arrangements. Neither George nor Chloe objected. Liam would continue living primarily in the family home while maintaining regular time with both parents. George appreciated that no one attempted to use Liam as leverage, at least not yet. During the recess, several attorneys gathered outside the courtroom discussing unrelated cases. George stood quietly beside a window overlooking the Chicago River. Emily joined him. You did well. I answered questions. Exactly. George watched traffic crossing the bridge below. Benjamin wanted something. Emily smiled. He wanted you to argue. George thought back. The confidentiality question. Yes. If you had started explaining apex flow. I couldn't. You also shouldn't. She folded her arms. Never interrupt an opponent who's building an incomplete story. George looked toward her. Because eventually facts arrive. Emily nodded. And facts don't get emotional. Court resumed. Benjamin requested expedited property evaluations. Emily agreed. Benjamin proposed temporary financial assumptions based on George's current salary. Emily made no objection. George noticed that surprised Benjamin. Judge Sullivan finalized several procedural orders before looking toward both parties. I expect complete cooperation. Both attorneys nodded. She continued, This court values documentation. George almost smiled. Emily had predicted exactly that. As everyone prepared to leave, Benjamin approached George again. You handled yourself well. Thank you. Benjamin adjusted his cufflinks. I imagine this process will stay straightforward. George answered honestly. I hope so. Benjamin smiled. I think your situation is relatively uncomplicated. George simply nodded. He made no effort to correct him. No effort to explain confidential equity agreements. No effort to mention Apex Flow. No effort to discuss Andrew Collins. Benjamin walked away, convinced he understood the case. Emily watched him leave. What are you thinking? George asked. He believes he has already mapped the entire board. And? He hasn't noticed half the pieces. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for unrelated criminal proceedings. Nobody recognized George. Nobody photographed Chloe. Nobody cared. They were simply another divorcing couple leaving another courthouse. George preferred it that way. On the drive back toward Naperville, his phone remained silent until he reached Interstate 88. Then Andrew Collins called. How'd court go? Routine. No surprises. George thought for a second. Only one. What? The judge asked about confidential contracts. Andrew became quiet. What did you say? The truth. Andrew exhaled slowly. Good. They're still protected. They always will be. After ending the call, George continued driving. Clouds hung low across northern Illinois. Traffic slowed near Oak Brook. Nothing about the afternoon suggested that his life had changed. Yet somewhere inside Judge Sullivan's courtroom file, one handwritten note now existed. Confidential contractual interests. Benjamin Carter had treated it like a technical detail. Emily Parker had treated it like a future turning point. George wasn't certain which one would ultimately matter, but he knew something from years spent solving manufacturing crises. The smallest, overlooked detail often determined the outcome of the entire system, and Benjamin had just overlooked one. 3 days after the first hearing, George received an email marked confidential. It contained only 4 words. Board clearance officially approved. No signature was necessary. He recognized the sender immediately. Andrew Collins. George closed the email without replying. Not because the news lacked importance, because he had spent too many years learning that celebration before completion often became regret. He placed the phone back into his pocket and walked across the warehouse floor at Midwest Integrated Manufacturing. Around him, nothing had changed. Forklifts continued moving steel containers. Production managers argued over delivery schedules. Machines stamped precision components with relentless rhythm. George spent the next 2 hours solving an unexpected shortage of industrial sensors arriving from Toledo. A younger engineer approached him afterward. I don't know how you always figure this stuff out. George smiled. I ask different questions. The engineer laughed. I ask questions too. George nodded. But you ask what failed. And you? I ask what failed first. The engineer looked confused. George picked up a production report. Problems usually start long before people notice them. The young man thought about that for a moment before walking away. George quietly returned to work. That sentence had defined almost every important decision of his adult life, especially Apex Flow. 5 years earlier, Andrew Collins had invited George to Austin for what sounded like an ordinary consulting discussion. George almost declined. His calendar was full. Production deadlines filled every week. Liam had a baseball tournament that Saturday. But Andrew insisted. You'll understand once you see it. George flew to Texas on the first flight Saturday morning. Andrew rented a small conference room inside an aging industrial building far from the glass towers downtown. No investors, no expensive furniture, only whiteboards covered with warehouse diagrams, supply routes, rail maps, factory schedules. Andrew looked exhausted. I've built software. George studied the diagrams. I can see that. It works. I'm sure. But nobody buys it. George looked toward him. Why? Because they don't trust it. George walked slowly around the room. He stopped beside a flowchart connecting suppliers across 6 states. Then he erased half of it. Andrew stared. What are you doing? Removing the software? Andrew frowned. But that's the product. No. George picked up another marker. This is. He drew a simple circle. Inside it, he wrote one word. Confidence. Manufacturing executives, George explained, never purchased technology. They purchased predictability. If software reduced uncertainty, they invested. If software simply looked intelligent, they ignored it. That single conversation completely changed Apex Flow. Instead of selling algorithms, they sold measurable operational certainty. Instead of promising innovation, they promised fewer production shutdowns. Instead of talking about artificial intelligence, they talked about keeping factories open. Sales doubled, then tripled. Within 18 months, Apex Flow expanded into multiple states. Andrew repeatedly appeared in industry publications as the company's founder. George never appeared anywhere. That had been intentional. Andrew handled visibility. George built the systems beneath it. Every major logistics model passed through George first. Every national expansion strategy, every operational guarantee, every large manufacturing proposal. His fingerprints existed everywhere. His name almost nowhere. Back in Chicago, people continued assuming he spent late evenings doing ordinary corporate work. George never corrected them. Sometimes secrecy felt lonely. But contracts weren't suggestions. They were obligations. One evening, Andrew flew into Chicago unexpectedly. They met inside a small restaurant near Midway Airport. Nothing expensive, nothing fashionable. Exactly the kind of place George preferred. Andrew arrived carrying only a backpack. No assistant, no security, no publicity. He ordered coffee before speaking. I've got something. George waited. Andrew removed a thin folder. Inside rested the newest ownership documents. George carefully reviewed every page. Nothing surprised him. Their original agreement remained intact. Ownership percentages, voting rights, equity conversion, protection clauses, everything reflected years of careful planning. Andrew watched him read. You still check every line. I always will. You wrote half of them. George smiled slightly. That's why I read them. Andrew laughed. You've never changed. No. Andrew leaned forward. Do you know what investors asked me yesterday? George looked up. They wanted to know why I trust one operations executive in Chicago with decisions worth hundreds of millions. What did you tell them? Andrew answered without hesitation. I told them George White has never once made a decision based on ego. George looked away. The compliment made him uncomfortable. Andrew continued. They expected technical reasons. They didn't get them. They got something better. George remained silent. Andrew opened another page. Titan Manufacturing. George immediately recognized the proposal. America's largest independent heavy equipment manufacturer, facilities across the Midwest and Southeast, nearly 40,000 employees. Winning that partnership would permanently change Apex Flow's valuation. Andrew pointed toward one paragraph. They accepted your operational framework. George reread it. Guaranteed downtime reductions. Predictive inventory optimization. Emergency supplier switching. Every concept originated from notebooks George had filled years earlier while sitting alone inside factory conference rooms. No glamour, just observations. Machines broke, people improvised, costs exploded. He learned patterns, then converted those patterns into systems. Andrew smiled. They're buying your brain. George shook his head. They're buying reliability. Exactly. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When they finally stood outside the restaurant, airplanes crossed overhead toward Midway. Andrew looked unusually serious. I need to ask you something. George waited. Has Chloe ever questioned why you're always working? George thought carefully. Yes. What do you tell her? The truth. Andrew looked puzzled. You tell her about Apex Flow? No. I tell her I'm building something. Andrew sighed. I always hated that. So did I. You sacrificed a lot. George didn't answer, because Andrew already knew. Missed vacations, late dinners, weekend flights, confidential meetings, all invisible. None of them appeared inside family photo albums. Andrew spoke again. When this becomes public, George interrupted gently. If. When? George smiled faintly. You've always been more optimistic. Somebody has to be. Andrew placed one hand on George's shoulder. I hope people eventually understand what you've done. George looked towards the dark runway lights. They don't have to. Andrew frowned. I disagree. George shook his head slowly. I didn't build Apex Flow to become famous. What did you build it for? George answered immediately. So factories stopped shutting down because good people lacked good information. Andrew laughed quietly. You really believe that? I do. On the drive home, George reflected on how strange success often appeared. Andrew received applause. George received confidentiality agreements. Andrew gave keynote speeches. George solved warehouse failures before sunrise. Andrew's face appeared in business magazines. George still drove the same aging Honda Accord. Neither arrangement bothered him. Recognition had never been part of the agreement. When he reached home, Liam sat at the kitchen table studying geometry. Dad. Yeah? Can you explain this? George spent 20 minutes drawing triangles on scrap paper. When Liam finally understood, he smiled. You're a better teacher than my math book. George laughed. The book isn't trying very hard. Liam hesitated. Dad. What? Mom says you're always working because your company needs you. George looked at his son. My company? Yeah. George considered the wording carefully. I help people solve problems. Big problems. Sometimes. Liam nodded. That's kinda cool. George smiled. I think so. Later that night, after Liam had gone upstairs, George opened his laptop one final time. A secure video call request appeared. Andrew again. George answered. Andrew looked unusually excited. The legal department just finished. George immediately understood. What finished? The final government review. George remained perfectly still. No more regulatory delays. No. No more restructuring. No. Andrew smiled broadly. We're clear. George slowly leaned back in his chair. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of invisible work. 5 years of waiting for exactly this moment. Andrew spoke softly. I'll send the signing schedule tomorrow. George closed his eyes for only a second, then opened them again. There was still paperwork to complete, still signatures to place, still legal procedures ahead. But for the first time since everything began, the finish line was no longer hidden beyond the horizon. It was finally close enough to see. George chose a dark gray suit for the signing. It wasn't new. He had worn it to supplier negotiations, manufacturing conferences, and Liam's middle school awards ceremony. The cuffs showed slight wear. The leather briefcase he carried had a small scratch across one corner. Nothing about him suggested he was walking toward one of the most significant financial moments of his life. The offices of Apex Flow Technologies occupied the top 3 floors of a renovated industrial building overlooking Lady Bird Lake in Austin. The location reflected the company itself. Modern without being extravagant, practical instead of flashy. Glass walls overlooked old rail yards that had once supplied factories across Texas. George arrived 15 minutes early. Andrew Collins was already waiting. "So," Andrew said with a grin, "today feels different." George looked around the conference room. "Today feels official?" Andrew laughed. "I'll take that." The room slowly filled with attorneys, accountants, board members, and corporate officers. No television cameras, no reporters, no photographers. Just professionals completing years of legal work. George recognized most of the faces from confidential meetings held over the previous 5 years. Each person nodded respectfully. Several walked over to shake his hand. One board member, Harold Benton, smiled broadly. "I've wanted to meet the man behind the operational model." George returned the handshake. "It's good to meet you." Harold laughed. "I've already met your work." George smiled politely. "I suppose that's true." Another board member joined them. Angela Morris had spent nearly 30 years leading industrial acquisitions. She studied George carefully. "I've heard one story repeated all week." George waited. "You've never once missed a deadline." "I've had good teams." She smiled. "Andrew said you'd answer like that." George simply shrugged. The conference table contained thick legal binders waiting beside every chair. Each binder represented years of negotiations, ownership restructuring, intellectual property assignments, federal compliance, tax planning, investor protections. George opened his copy. Every page had already been reviewed dozens of times. Still, he read everything again. Andrew leaned toward him. "You know, nobody else is rereading every sentence." George kept turning pages. "That doesn't change anything." Andrew smiled. "It never does." At exactly 10 o'clock, the lead corporate attorney entered. "Good morning, everyone." Conversation stopped immediately. "We're here to finalize the ownership restructuring of Apex Flow Technologies." The attorney outlined every procedural step: signatures, witness verification, electronic filings, state registration, federal notifications. George listened carefully, not because he distrusted anyone, because details mattered. After 45 minutes, the attorney placed one document directly in front of George. "Mr. White." George looked down. This was the page. The final equity conversion. Once signed years of restricted ownership, interests would officially become unrestricted equity. Andrew watched quietly. "So," George picked up the pen. He paused only long enough to reread the signature block. Then he signed. George White. The signature looked almost ordinary. The consequences were not. One by one, the remaining signatures followed. Witnesses signed, corporate officers signed, legal counsel signed. The attorney collected every document. "Congratulations." The room applauded. George lowered the pen onto the table. He did not stand. He did not celebrate. He simply looked toward the window where freight trains rolled slowly across distant tracks. Factories would still open tomorrow. Workers would still report before sunrise. Supply chains would still need solving. Money changed many things. Responsibility remained one of them. Andrew finally broke the silence. "You realize you're officially one of the largest individual shareholders now." George nodded once. "I read the agreement." Andrew laughed. "That's your response. What response were you expecting?" "I don't know." "Excitement." George considered it. "I've been excited for 5 years." The room laughed softly. The corporate attorney returned, carrying another folder. There's one additional matter. George looked up. The Titan manufacturing agreement. Andrew smiled immediately. They signed, the attorney nodded, this morning. Several executives exchanged pleased glances. Titan Manufacturing represented the company's largest client by a considerable margin. The agreement included facilities across 12 states. Projected revenue exceeded every previous contract Apex Flow had secured. The chief financial officer opened a spreadsheet on the large conference display. Updated company valuation. The room became quiet. The numbers were significantly higher than projections made only weeks earlier. Andrew slowly looked toward George. Nine? I think you'll want to see this. George studied the revised figures. His ownership percentage remained unchanged. The company's value had not. The increase was extraordinary. Years of invisible work had quietly transformed into a financial reality few people would believe. George leaned back. His expression barely changed. Angela Morris watched him carefully. I've seen executives react to smaller numbers by ordering champagne. George smiled. I still have a flight home. The room laughed again. Harold Benton shook his head. I understand now. George looked toward him. Understand what? Andrew wasn't exaggerating. Andrew folded his arms. I never do. Harold continued. Most people spend years chasing recognition. He pointed toward George. You spent years building value. The meeting ended shortly after noon. Outside the conference room, Andrew and George stood beside the windows overlooking Austin. You know what's coming next? George nodded. Attention? A lot of it. I'd rather avoid it. Andrew laughed. I know. His phone buzzed. He checked the screen, then smiled. You might not have a choice. George raised an eyebrow. What happened? Andrew turned the phone around. An email from Rachel Morgan, Senior Features Editor, Forbes. Subject line request for executive profile interview. George read it twice. They're contacting you. They're asking about both of us. George looked again. Rachel explained that several manufacturing executives had independently described Apex Flow as one of the most influential companies quietly reshaping American industrial logistics. Multiple investors had mentioned George's unusual role. She wanted to understand why the man responsible for much of the company's operational strategy had remained almost completely unknown. George handed the phone back. I don't need publicity. Andrew smiled. You may not. The company does. George knew he was right. Investors valued visibility. Customers trusted familiar names. Recruiting talented engineers became easier when respected publications recognized a company's work. Still, the attention felt unfamiliar. For years, George had intentionally stayed outside the spotlight. Now, the spotlight had found him. His flight landed in Chicago shortly after 7 that evening. He drove home through familiar suburban streets, the same gas station, the same grocery store, the same traffic lights. Nothing had changed. He parked the Honda in the driveway. Inside, Liam sat at the dining table assembling a model bridge for science class. Hey, Dad. Hey. How was Texas? Productive. Liam grinned. That's your answer for everything. George laughed softly. It usually is. They spent the next hour working on the bridge together. Tiny wooden sticks, glue, engineering diagrams. Liam accidentally snapped one support beam. I ruined it. George picked up another piece. No? What do you mean? We learned which design doesn't work. Liam smiled. You always say things like that. George looked at the unfinished bridge. Most failures are instructions. Later that night, after Liam had gone upstairs, George finally opened his laptop. There were 43 unread emails. Most came from Apex Flow executives, One came from Emily Parker. Discovery continues next week. No major changes. Another came from Andrew. The subject simply read, "Congratulations." George replied with only 3 words, "Back to work." Andrew answered less than a minute later. "That's exactly why Forbes wants you." George stared at the message. Then another notification appeared. Rachel Morgan again. This time the email contained a proposed interview schedule and one final sentence. "We believe your story isn't about becoming wealthy. We believe it's about building extraordinary value where almost nobody was looking." George read that sentence twice. For the first time all day, he allowed himself a quiet smile. Someone had finally understood the real story. Not the money, not the ownership, not even the company. The years spent doing important work without needing anyone to notice. He closed the laptop, switched off the office light, and walked upstairs. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Inside one ordinary suburban house, however, George White had just crossed a line that would soon become impossible for the rest of the world to ignore. Monday morning began with another envelope. Unlike the previous legal correspondence, this one carried the logo of Forbes. George opened it while standing in his kitchen. Inside was a formal interview agreement, a proposed publication timeline, and a handwritten note from Rachel Morgan. Mr. White. After speaking with executives across the manufacturing sector, one thing became remarkably consistent. Every conversation about Apex Flow eventually became a conversation about you. I'd like to understand why. George folded the note carefully before placing it back inside the envelope. He finished his coffee, packed Liam's lunch, drove him to school, then continued to work exactly as he had every weekday for more than a decade. Success, he believed, should never become an excuse to neglect ordinary responsibilities. At Midwest Integrated Manufacturing, the loading dock was already behind schedule. A freight carrier from Indiana had experienced mechanical problems overnight. 3 production lines risked shutting down before noon. George spent the next 4 hours coordinating emergency shipments. He never mentioned Forbes. He never mentioned Apex Flow. By lunchtime, production had returned to normal. His plant manager walked into George's office carrying 2 coffees. "I owe you one." George accepted the cup. "It was a team effort." The manager smiled. "I've worked with you 11 years. George looked up. "You've said that before." "I'm saying something different." George waited. "I still don't know how you stay so calm." George looked through the office window toward the warehouse floor. "Panicking doesn't unload trucks." The manager laughed. "No. It usually delays them." The conversation ended there. George preferred practical conclusions over inspirational speeches. That evening, he drove downtown for another meeting with Emily Parker. Her office table had changed. Evidence binders now covered nearly every available surface. Each binder carried colored labels: financial records, property, communications, discovery, business interests. Emily motioned toward one chair. "We've received another disclosure." George sat down. "Good. Useful." She opened a binder. "The banking subpoenas are complete." George studied the spreadsheets spread across the table. Several unfamiliar accounts now appeared connected through transfer histories. Emily tapped one highlighted section. "We finally know where the money went." George remained quiet. "The $48,000 cashier's check." She slid another page toward him. "It never financed Chloe's office." George looked carefully. Instead, the money had moved into a privately held investment account under an LLC formed nearly 4 years earlier, Lakeview Property Holdings. George frowned. "I've never heard of it." "I know." Emily opened another folder. "The LLC ownership records arrived this morning." George immediately noticed one name: Chloe White. A second name appeared underneath: Nathan Reynolds. George searched his memory. The name sounded familiar. Then he remembered. Nathan Reynolds owned a luxury property investment company. George had met him once during a charity fundraiser almost 2 years earlier, only briefly. Emily continued. The investment account received several transfers from your joint household funds. George kept reading. Smaller deposits. $12,000, $8,000, $15,000, each spaced months apart. Individually, they appeared ordinary. Together, they formed a much larger picture. Emily spoke carefully. I'm not suggesting criminal conduct. George nodded. But I'm saying the financial narrative presented by opposing counsel is incomplete. George leaned back. Benjamin Carter had repeatedly described Chloe as carrying greater financial responsibility during the marriage. These records suggested something very different. Joint household funds had quietly financed outside investments George had never been told existed. Emily folded her hands. We'll request explanations. What if there are reasonable ones? Then we'll receive them. George appreciated her answer. Evidence first, interpretation second. She never reversed the order. Before leaving, Emily handed George another document. Forbes contacted me. George looked surprised. They did. They wanted to verify several facts. What did you tell them? The truth. She smiled slightly. I told them you're the least dramatic client I've ever represented. George laughed quietly. I don't know whether that's a compliment. It is. She paused. I also declined to discuss your divorce. George nodded. Thank you. They weren't interested anyway. What were they interested in? Emily looked directly at him. How someone with your level of influence remained invisible for so long, driving home. George thought about that question. Invisible. He had never viewed himself that way. He simply believed work mattered more than attention. Tuesday afternoon brought the interview. Rachel Morgan arrived at Apex Flow's Chicago satellite office, carrying only a notebook and a small voice recorder. No photographer, no film crew, no dramatic entrance. George appreciated that immediately. Rachel smiled as they shook hands. I expected a much larger office. George looked around. So did our accountant. She laughed. I've interviewed founders worth billions. George waited. They usually decorate more. George glanced toward the plain walls. I spend most of my time in factories. Rachel switched on the recorder. I'd like to start there. For years, you've remained almost unknown. Correct. Why? George answered without hesitation. The work required it. Rachel leaned forward. Most executives enjoy recognition. I'm not most executives. She smiled. I've noticed. For nearly 2 hours, Rachel asked questions few reporters would have considered important. Not about wealth, not about luxury, not about private jets. Instead, she asked about warehouse shutdowns, supply chain failures, manufacturing bottlenecks, why George still visited production floors personally, why he continued driving an old Honda despite becoming extraordinarily wealthy. George answered each question simply. My car still works. Rachel laughed. That's really your answer? Yes. You've never wanted something more impressive. George looked toward the parking lot. I've wanted more reliable factories. She stopped writing for a moment. That's going in the article. Near the end of the interview, Rachel asked one unexpected question. What accomplishment are you most proud of? George thought longer than before. Rachel waited patiently. Finally, he answered. My son still asks me for homework help. She looked surprised. Not Apex Flow. George smiled. A company can always grow? She remained silent. You only get one chance to raise a child. Rachel slowly closed her notebook. I think I understand now. What? Why everyone kept pointing me toward you. The interview ended without fanfare. George returned to reviewing operational reports before driving home. Life continued. Court deadlines remained. Discovery continued. Forbes would publish whenever they were ready. Nothing required immediate celebration. 3 days later, Benjamin Carter filed another motion. Emily called George that evening. They're requesting accelerated financial valuation. George sat down at his desk. Why now? I have a theory. What is it? They believe they've already identified everything of value. George almost smiled. They haven't. No, Emily paused. But don't underestimate them. I won't. They're intelligent. I know. She lowered her voice. The problem isn't intelligence. What is it? They're evaluating yesterday's numbers. George understood immediately. The Apex Flow restructuring had already been completed. The Titan contract had already been signed. The valuation had already changed. None of that yet appeared inside the financial disclosures Benjamin believed represented George's future. George looked at the calendar. The timing suddenly mattered. Very much. If Emily was right, opposing counsel was building an entire legal strategy using assumptions that were already becoming obsolete. And somewhere inside the offices of Forbes, Rachel Morgan was writing a story that would soon make those outdated assumptions impossible to maintain. Benjamin Carter disliked surprises. That was one of the reasons he had become one of Chicago's most respected divorce attorneys. He believed every case could be reduced to documents, numbers, and predictable human behavior. Until now, George White had fit neatly inside that model. Emily Parker intended to change that. 3 weeks after the initial hearing, both legal teams gathered inside a conference room for formal financial discovery. No judge, no spectators. Only attorneys, accountants, court reporters, and stacks of documents. George arrived carrying 2 identical black binders. Emily carried 6. Benjamin glanced at them. Planning to build a library? Emily smiled politely. I prefer complete records. Benjamin took his seat without another comment. Across the room, Chloe remained composed. She wore another tailored business suit and reviewed printed financial summaries with practiced confidence. George acknowledged her with a brief nod. Nothing more. The court reporter administered the standard oath. Emily spoke first. We'll begin with household financial transfers. Benjamin leaned back comfortably. No objection. Emily opened the first binder. Mr. White. Yes. Did you authorize routine household expenses during the marriage? Yes. Did you routinely review monthly bank statements? I did. She placed several statements before him. Do these appear accurate? Yes. Benjamin remained relaxed. Routine questions? Routine answers? Exactly as expected. Emily turned another page. Please identify this cashier's check. George examined it. I requested it. For what purpose? I believed the funds would support Chloe's business expansion. Emily nodded. And did they? George answered carefully. I don't know. Benjamin stood. Objection. Emily looked toward him. On what basis? Calls for speculation. Emily didn't argue. I'll rephrase. She looked back at George. Do you possess documentation showing the funds entered Chloe's business accounts? No. Emily placed another document beside the first. This is the receiving account. George studied the numbers. I've never seen it before. Emily continued. Do you own Lakeview Property Holdings, LLC? No. Have you ever invested in Lakeview Property Holdings, LLC? No. Benjamin's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Emily noticed. She continued without pause. Did you authorize household funds for investment in Lakeview Property Holdings? No. Benjamin stood again. We'll reserve questions regarding ownership until foundation has been established. Emily smiled. Of course. She handed copies across the table. Articles of organization, bank registration, ownership records. Benjamin read the first page, then the second. His expression remained controlled. Only his eyes slowed. George noticed. For the first time since proceedings began, Benjamin was reading instead of speaking. Emily allowed several seconds of silence. Then she continued. The registered owners are Chloe White and Nathan Reynolds. The room became noticeably quieter. Benjamin carefully closed the folder. We'll review these documents. Emily nodded. I encourage it. George remained completely still. He neither looked toward Chloe nor attempted to interpret the records. Facts had been introduced. Nothing more. The discovery session paused briefly while both legal teams reviewed additional documentation. Benjamin eventually spoke. We request copies of all supporting banking materials. Emily slid another binder across the table. Already prepared. Benjamin accepted it. Inside were complete transfer histories, deposit records, account summaries, corporate filings. George had spent weeks locating many of those documents. Benjamin turned page after page. The confidence he displayed during the first hearing had not disappeared, but it had become noticeably more cautious. After lunch, discussion shifted toward George's financial interests. Benjamin regained momentum. Mr. White. Yes. You've stated you work as a senior operations executive. Correct. You receive a salary. Yes. Benjamin projected several payroll records onto a conference monitor. These accurately reflect your compensation. They do. Benjamin looked satisfied. No additional comments. Emily remained seated, then quietly reached for another binder. I have several. Benjamin looked toward her. Emily addressed George. Mr. White. Yes. Have you entered into confidentiality agreements relating to business ownership? I have. Benjamin immediately objected. We've already established those agreements exist. Emily nodded. Correct. I'm establishing chronology. Benjamin sat back down. Emily continued. Were those agreements executed before your separation? Yes. Were they executed during your marriage? Yes. Have those agreements remained legally binding until recently? Yes. Emily placed a sealed envelope onto the conference table. This contains documentation subject to the protective order previously approved. Benjamin accepted the envelope. He removed the first document. Then another. Then another. George watched his expression change again. This time the shift lasted longer. Benjamin read every page twice. Finally, he looked toward Emily. When were these executed? Emily answered calmly. The originals were signed 5 years ago. Benjamin looked again. And recently converted. Correct. George recognized the documents immediately. The finalized Apex Flow ownership agreements. Protected until legal conversion. Now discoverable. Benjamin slowly closed the folder. He no longer appeared relaxed. Instead, he looked thoughtful. Very thoughtful. The certified public accountant hired by Benjamin asked several technical questions regarding valuation timing. George answered each one precisely. Every answer matched written documentation. Every date aligned. Every signature corresponded. Emily had insisted upon meticulous preparation. Now the preparation mattered. Benjamin finally asked the question himself. What percentage ownership does Mr. White currently possess? Emily handed over another certified document. Benjamin read it silently. The accountant leaned closer. Neither spoke for nearly 30 seconds. George waited. Emily waited. The silence became unusually heavy. Finally, Benjamin looked toward George. I wasn't aware. George answered politely. The agreements were confidential. Benjamin nodded slowly. I see that. No irritation, no argument, only recognition that an important assumption had disappeared. The remainder of the afternoon focused on valuation experts, projected business worth, restricted equity calculations, tax consequences, future appreciation. George spoke only when addressed. He never attempted to emphasize numbers. Emily handled the strategy. By 5 o'clock, the conference ended. Benjamin approached Emily near the elevators. George remained several steps away, reviewing papers. "I'll admit something." Emily looked at him. "I underestimated this file." Emily smiled politely. "I suspected." Benjamin glanced toward George. "He never corrected the record." Emily answered immediately. "Nobody asked the correct questions." Benjamin laughed once. "Fair enough." He hesitated. "Your client is unusual." "I know. He doesn't behave like wealthy clients." Emily looked toward George, who was helping the court reporter carry heavy document boxes toward the hallway. "No. He behaves like an engineer." Benjamin watched George return, carrying another stack. "I've spent weeks trying to understand him." Emily answered quietly. "Most people mistake quiet for simple." Benjamin nodded. "Perhaps." As George joined them, Benjamin extended his hand. "Mr. White." George shook it. "I appreciate your professionalism today." "You as well." Benjamin studied him for another second. "I imagine things are becoming clearer." George considered the statement. "They're becoming more complete." Benjamin smiled. "A very careful answer." George simply nodded. Outside the building, Emily and George walked toward the parking garage. "You noticed?" Emily asked. "What?" "Benjamin stopped trying to define you." George unlocked his car. "I noticed." He shifted. George thought back through the afternoon. At the beginning of discovery, Benjamin believed George represented a straightforward financial profile. By the end, every future calculation required revision. Emily looked pleased. "We're still not finished." George closed the briefcase inside the trunk. "What comes next?" "The valuation reports." "And after that?" Emily smiled. "The world starts catching up." That evening, George returned home to find Liam asleep on the living room couch beside an unfinished history assignment. George gently covered him with a blanket. The television displayed muted evening news. Nothing about Apex Flow, nothing about Forbes, nothing about the divorce. The world remained completely unaware that an ordinary-looking man in suburban Illinois had quietly altered the financial assumptions of an entire legal case in a single afternoon. His phone vibrated. Rachel Morgan, one new email. Subject, final fact verification. George opened it. Only one question remained. "Before publication, can you confirm one detail? Did anyone outside Apex Flow know the full extent of your ownership before this month?" George looked toward the quiet house, then typed a single sentence. "No, that was the point." He pressed send. Within seconds, Rachel replied, "Thank you. That answer completes the story." George set the phone down. Across town, Benjamin Carter was undoubtedly recalculating strategy. Somewhere in Manhattan, Forbes editors were finalizing layouts for an upcoming issue. Neither group yet realized those two separate timelines were moving toward exactly the same day. The magazine reached Chicago on a Thursday morning. Most people never noticed exactly when new issues appeared on bookstore shelves. Rachel Morgan did. She stood inside a Manhattan newsstand shortly after 6 o'clock, picked up the first printed copy, and examined it in silence. The cover showed George White standing inside an active manufacturing facility. No luxury office, no private jet, no designer watch. Only a charcoal work jacket draped over one shoulder, rolled up sleeves, and rows of automated production lines fading into the background. Above the image appeared a single headline: "The Quiet Architect of America's New Industrial Era." The subheading was shorter: "Why George White Spent Years Building Billion-Dollar Value Without Asking Anyone to Notice." Rachel smiled. The story had survived editing, exactly as she intended. 2 hours later, copies reached Chicago. George did not see one immediately. He was standing inside Plant 3, inspecting a conveyor system that had begun producing inconsistent measurements overnight. A maintenance supervisor approached. "We think it's the sensor array." George knelt beside the machine. "No." The supervisor frowned. "You haven't even opened it." George pointed toward several finished components. "The measurements drift gradually." "So, if it were sensors, they'd fail randomly." The supervisor looked again. "What causes gradual drift?" George touched one of the drive rollers. "Where?" 30 minutes later, the machine resumed normal operation. The supervisor shook his head. "You keep doing that." George stood. "Doing what?" "Seeing things before everyone else." George smiled. "I've just been wrong enough times to recognize patterns." His phone vibrated. Andrew Collins. George answered while walking toward his office. "You've seen it?" Andrew asked immediately. "Seen what?" A brief silence followed. "You haven't." "I've been working." Andrew laughed. "Of course you have." "What happened?" "Stop by the front office." George frowned slightly. "Why?" "They've got something waiting." 20 minutes later, he entered the administrative lobby. The receptionist smiled unusually brightly. "Morning, George." "Morning." She reached beneath the reception desk. "I think this belongs to you." She placed a magazine on the counter. George looked down. For several seconds, he said nothing. His own photograph stared back at him. The title occupied nearly half the page. "The Quiet Architect of America's New Industrial Era." He picked up the magazine carefully, almost cautiously. The receptionist laughed softly. "We've already had 3 people ask if it's really you." George looked at the cover again. "It is. You never mentioned any of this." "I wasn't asked." She smiled. "I guess that's true." George carried the magazine into his office. He closed the door, then slowly opened to the first page. Rachel had written exactly what she promised. No sensationalism, no exaggerated biography, only facts. His early manufacturing career. Years spent solving operational failures. Confidential collaboration with Andrew Collins. The creation of Apex Flow's predictive logistics framework. The years of silence required by contractual obligations. She even included one sentence George barely remembered saying. "Recognition is temporary. Reliable systems keep families employed." Rachel had built the article around that idea. The story wasn't about sudden wealth. It was about quiet preparation. His phone began ringing before he finished reading. Andrew. Then Angela Morris. Then Harold Benton. Then executives George had not spoken with in months. Every conversation sounded similar. "Congratulations. Well deserved. About time." George thanked each caller politely. Nothing more. At 11 that morning, Emily Parker called. "You've become difficult to reach." George smiled. "I've answered every call." "I know." She paused. "Have you checked today's financial news?" "No." "You should." George opened his laptop. Apex Flow's latest funding announcement appeared across multiple business websites. Every article linked to the Forbes profile. The company's visibility had increased dramatically overnight. Investor interest followed immediately. Emily continued. "Timing matters." George understood. "Benjamin has seen it." "I guarantee he has." "Has he called?" "Not yet." "He will." Emily's prediction proved accurate. At 1:40 p.m., Benjamin Carter requested an emergency scheduling conference. Not because the article itself changed legal facts, because the article revealed publicly documented financial information that no longer allowed anyone to argue George's future earning capacity remained ordinary. Emily read Benjamin's motion over the phone. "He wants updated valuation reports." George nodded. "Reasonable." "It is?" She sounded almost amused. "But he's requesting them because reality moved faster than strategy." George returned to work. The warehouse still required attention. Delivery trucks still arrived late. Employees still asked questions. One operator stopped him near the assembly line. "George?" "Yeah." "Is this really you?" He held up the magazine. George glanced at the cover. "Looks like me." The operator laughed. "My wife thinks I'm making it up." George smiled. "Tell her it's real." Within hours, copies circulated throughout the factory. People who had worked beside George for years suddenly discovered details they had never imagined. Some reacted with disbelief, others with admiration. None reacted with resentment, because George had never behaved differently before. The magazine had changed what they knew. It had not changed who he was. Late that afternoon, George drove to Liam's school. Classes had already ended. Parents waited outside. Children crossed the parking lot carrying backpacks. Liam climbed into the passenger seat. "Dad?" "Yeah." "My science teacher asked if you're famous." George looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said you're just my dad." George smiled. "Good answer." Liam pulled the magazine from his backpack. "My friend Ethan brought this." George laughed quietly. "Already? Everyone keeps asking questions." "What questions?" "Whether we're rich." George considered the question. "What did you tell them?" Liam shrugged. "I said we still eat pizza on Fridays." George laughed harder. "Also true." On the drive home, Liam turned pages carefully. "They called you an architect." "Not the building kind." "I know." Liam kept reading. "They said you helped save factories." George glanced toward his son. "I helped people make better decisions." "That's cooler." George smiled, but said nothing. That evening, another envelope arrived. Not from Forbes, not from Apex Flow, from the court. Emily had forwarded updated scheduling orders. Final valuation hearings would begin sooner than expected. Benjamin wanted the financial record completed immediately. George placed the envelope beside the magazine. Two separate worlds now occupied the same kitchen table. One represented public recognition. The other represented private accountability. He cared more about the second. Around 8 o'clock, his phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. George answered. "George White," a woman's voice responded. "Mr. White, this is Karen Mitchell from the Chicago Business Leadership Forum." George listened. "We'd like to invite you to deliver our annual keynote." "Thank you." "We understand you've received many invitations today." George looked at the magazine again. "Probably. We hope you'll consider ours." "I appreciate the invitation. We're holding the date for 48 hours. After ending the call, another message appeared. Then another. Universities, industry conferences, podcasts, television producers. Interview requests accumulated faster than George could read them. He closed the email application. Tomorrow's production schedule still required review. Near midnight, while finishing those reports, one final message arrived. From Rachel Morgan. No subject line. Only one sentence. "The story is now public. What people choose to do with it belongs to them." George read it once, then looked out the kitchen window toward the quiet suburban street. His neighbors' houses looked exactly the same as they had yesterday. The sidewalk, the mailbox, the old maple tree. Nothing outside had changed. Inside countless offices across America, however, executives, investors, attorneys, and business journalists were reading the same article. Some saw opportunity, some saw inspiration. One man somewhere in downtown Chicago saw something entirely different. Benjamin Carter saw the foundation of his original legal strategy collapsing beneath carefully documented facts. And George suspected their next courtroom meeting would feel nothing like the first. The final hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Chicago woke beneath a cold gray sky. George left home before sunrise. He wore the same charcoal suit that had appeared on the Forbes cover. Not because of the article, because it remained the most comfortable suit he owned. He stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop. The young cashier looked at him twice before smiling. "You're George White?" George nodded. "I am. I read your story." "Thank you." She handed him his coffee. "My dad worked in manufacturing for 30 years. George listened. "He said your article was the first business story he'd ever finished reading?" George smiled. "I'm glad." "He said people like you usually don't get noticed." George accepted the coffee. "Sometimes that's okay." As he walked back toward his car, he reflected on her words. For years, remaining unnoticed had been an advantage. Today would be different. Inside the Daily Center courthouse, reporters had gathered earlier than usual. Not because of the divorce, because Forbes had transformed George into an unexpected public figure almost overnight. Emily Parker noticed the cameras immediately. "They're here." George nodded. "They'll stay outside." "They've already requested statements." George looked towards the courtroom doors. "We're not giving any." Emily smiled. "I didn't think so." Benjamin Carter arrived several minutes later. He greeted Emily with professional courtesy before approaching George. "Good morning." "Morning." Benjamin extended his hand. George shook it. "I read the article." George waited. "It explained several things." George simply nodded. Benjamin smiled faintly. "I imagine that's intentional." Before George could answer, the courtroom clerk announced that proceedings would begin. Everyone entered. Judge Rebecca Holloway took the bench precisely at 9. The courtroom settled into complete silence. She reviewed several documents before looking toward both legal teams. "I've reviewed the supplemental financial disclosures." Emily stood. "So have we, Your Honor." Benjamin nodded. "As have we." The judge adjusted her glasses. "It appears substantial information became available after the initial filing." Benjamin spoke first. "Correct, Your Honor." His tone had changed noticeably. Gone was the confidence built on incomplete assumptions. Now he sounded careful, measured. "We request that the court evaluate the updated financial record in its entirety." Emily remained standing. "We agree." The judge looked toward George. "Mr. White." "Yes, Your Honor. I've reviewed the ownership documentation submitted under protective order." George nodded. "Yes." "It appears these interests existed well before separation." "They did." "They were subject to contractual confidentiality." "Yes." Judge Holloway made another note. Then she turned towards Benjamin. "Counsel." Benjamin stood. "We acknowledge the ownership interests predate the dissolution." No argument. No attempt to challenge authenticity. Simply acknowledgement. Emily quietly opened another binder. "Your Honor, we'd also ask the court to consider recently completed discovery regarding marital financial transfers." Benjamin remained standing. "No objection." George noticed the subtle shift immediately. Benjamin no longer objected automatically. Evidence had changed the landscape. Emily projected several financial summaries onto the courtroom monitor. Joint account transfers, investment timelines, LLC ownership records. Everything appeared in strict chronological order. Judge Holloway studied every page. Benjamin did not interrupt. Neither did Chloe. The courtroom remained unusually quiet. Finally, the judge looked toward Chloe. "Mrs. White." Chloe stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Lakeview Property Holdings." A brief pause followed. "You held ownership interests during the marriage?" "Yes." "Using marital funds?" Benjamin rose immediately. "Your Honor, we request the opportunity to clarify context." The judge nodded. "You may." Benjamin approached carefully. His question sounded very different from earlier hearings. Not defensive, not aggressive, focused, professional. The answers remained limited, measured. Several financial decisions previously presented as ordinary household management now required considerably more explanation. George watched without satisfaction. Only observation. Facts unfolded at their own pace. No one forced them. The accountant appointed by the court then testified regarding Apex Flow's updated valuation. Charts appeared across the courtroom display. Historical values, current equity, projected appreciation. Every figure matched documents previously disclosed. Judge Holloway asked only one question. When did these ownership interests become unrestricted? The accountant answered. Approximately 1 month after the parties' divorce filing. The timing settled heavily across the courtroom, not because anyone had manipulated it, because years of preparation had reached completion exactly when the contracts required. Benjamin stood again. No evidence suggests intentional concealment during the marriage. The accountant agreed. Correct. Confidentiality obligations prevented public disclosure. Correct. George noticed Emily glance toward him briefly. No words, only acknowledgement. Truth no longer required explanation. The documents were speaking for themselves. During a short recess, George waited quietly near one courtroom window. Reporters remained outside the building. Television vans lined the street. Emily joined him. You've barely spoken. George looked toward the city skyline. You prepared well. She laughed softly. I'll accept that. After a moment, she added, You understand what's happening? George nodded. The case is becoming simpler. Exactly. She lowered her voice. People assume dramatic moments change outcomes. George looked towards the courtroom. They don't. Preparation does. George smiled. That's usually true. Court resumed 20 minutes later. Judge Holloway reviewed each remaining issue one by one. Property allocation, investment interests, future obligations, financial disclosures. Each decision rested upon documentary evidence rather than emotional testimony. George appreciated that. No raised voices, no theatrical arguments, only records. Near the end of the hearing, Judge Holloway removed her reading glasses. I wish to make one observation. The courtroom became completely silent. This court does not reward appearances. She looked toward both parties. It evaluates evidence. Nobody moved. The financial record presented today differs substantially from assumptions made at the beginning of these proceedings. She paused briefly. Not because facts changed. Another pause. Because all relevant facts eventually became available. George heard Emily quietly exhale beside him. Judge Holloway continued. Accordingly, this court will issue a revised property determination consistent with the complete evidentiary record. She announced several rulings, joint financial adjustments, recognition of previously undisclosed marital investments, recalculated distributions, acknowledgement of George's premarital and contractually restricted ownership interests. Every decision followed documented timelines. Every conclusion referenced evidence already entered into the record. Nothing sounded dramatic. That was precisely why it carried so much weight. Benjamin stood. No further argument, Your Honor. Emily remained seated. None from us. Judge Holloway closed the final folder. This matter is concluded. The gavel struck once, softly. Yet the sound echoed through the courtroom. George remained seated for several seconds. Not because he felt overwhelmed, because years of quiet discipline had finally reached their legal conclusion. Emily gathered her binders. You won. George looked toward the empty witness stand. The evidence did. She smiled. I knew you'd say that. Benjamin approached before leaving. He extended his hand once more. George accepted it. I owe you something. George waited. An apology. George remained silent. Benjamin continued. My first assessment of you was wrong, George answered calmly. You assessed incomplete information. Benjamin shook his head. No. I assessed appearances. For a moment, neither man spoke. Benjamin finally smiled. I won't make that mistake again. George nodded respectfully. I appreciate that. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged forward. Microphones, cameras, questions from every direction. Mr. White. Did Forbes change your case? Do you have a statement? How does it feel to become famous during your divorce? George paused only once before reaching his car. He looked toward the reporters, then answered with a single sentence. The magazine told my story. He opened the car door. The court followed the evidence. Nothing more. He drove away. Behind him, dozens of reporters repeated the same quote into cameras across Chicago. Inside the courthouse, Judge Holloway signed the final written order. And across Manhattan, Rachel Morgan watched the afternoon news with quiet satisfaction. The public had noticed the magazine, but the line people kept repeating was not hers. It belonged to George. The court followed the evidence. In a single sentence, he had explained everything. Life became unexpectedly quiet after the hearing, not because people stopped talking, because George stopped listening to most of the noise. The reporters eventually moved on. Another corporate merger, another political controversy, another celebrity scandal. The news cycle always found something new. George returned to the routines that had defined him long before anyone recognized his name. He woke before 6, prepared breakfast for Liam, reviewed production reports while drinking coffee, drove the same Honda to work, checked inventory, walked factory floors, spoke with technicians instead of executives whenever possible. 3 weeks after the final hearing, Apex Flow's board gathered in Austin for its quarterly strategy meeting. This time the atmosphere felt different, not tense, expectant. Andrew Collins greeted George near the entrance. I've got something you'll enjoy. George smiled. You usually say that before giving me more work. Andrew laughed. Fair. Inside the conference room, every board member had already arrived. Angela Morris stood as George entered. So, George took his seat. So, the article did exactly what we hoped. George waited. Our recruiting department received applications from engineers at companies that never answered our calls before. Harold Benton nodded. 3 Fortune 500 manufacturers requested meetings. The chief financial officer projected updated figures onto the large display. Revenue commitments had increased substantially. Investor confidence had strengthened. Expansion plans accelerated. Andrew folded his hands. I'd like the board to vote. George looked toward him. On what? Andrew smiled. You're still asking. The chairman stood. The board unanimously recommends appointing George White as executive chairman of Apex Flow Technologies. The room erupted into applause. George remained motionless, not out of hesitation, out of surprise. Andrew leaned closer. You honestly didn't know? No. We planned it that way. George looked around the table. Every board member smiled, not politely, genuinely. Angela spoke first. The company already follows your operational philosophy. Harold continued. This appointment simply acknowledges reality. The chairman addressed George directly. Will you accept? George looked down for a moment. Years earlier, he would have declined immediately, not because he lacked confidence, because titles had never interested him. Now he understood the role differently. Leadership created responsibility. Responsibility created opportunities for others. He finally answered, yes. The vote became official within minutes. No speeches, no ceremony, only signatures. Another legal document, another responsibility. Andrew whispered while everyone signed. You've noticed something. George nodded. The important days always end with paperwork. Andrew laughed loudly. Exactly. Following the meeting, George requested something unexpected. I'd like to visit Plant 7. Andrew looked confused. Today? Yes. The board planned a celebration dinner. George picked up his jacket. The machines don't know we held a meeting. Andrew stared at him for a second before laughing again. I'll cancel my reservation. 2 hours later, both men stood inside a manufacturing facility outside Austin. Production supervisors looked stunned. The newly appointed executive chairman walked through the warehouse carrying a clipboard instead of an entourage. One supervisor apologized immediately. We weren't expecting executives. George shook his head. You were expecting work? Yes. Good. He spent the afternoon speaking with machine operators, forklift drivers, maintenance technicians, quality inspectors. Most had never heard his title. Several had. None found him different from the man described in the Forbes article. That consistency mattered more than any speech. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Emily Parker closed George's legal file. She placed the final court order inside the archive folder. One assistant looked over curiously. That's the famous case, Emily smiled. The interesting one. The Forbes guy? Emily nodded. What was he really like? She considered the question. The easiest client I've ever represented. Really? He never asked me how to destroy someone. The assistant looked surprised. What did he ask? Emily smiled. Whether every document had been verified twice. The assistant laughed. Emily did not. That's why we won. Across town, Benjamin Carter attended a continuing legal education seminar. One presenter discussed recent high-profile financial disclosure cases. George's divorce briefly appeared as an anonymous case study. Benjamin listened carefully. The presenter emphasized a simple lesson. Never confuse limited information with complete information. Benjamin quietly wrote the sentence into his notebook. He intended to remember it. That evening, George returned home carrying nothing except a folder of operational reports. Liam sat at the dining table finishing algebra homework. Hey, Dad. Hey. How was Texas? Busy. Liam grinned. Were you on another magazine? George laughed. No. Good. Why good? Because Mrs. Daniels already made me explain the first one. George sat beside him. What are you working on? Quadratic equations. George picked up a pencil. Let's see. For the next hour, they solved math problems together. No discussion of court, no discussion of apex flow, no discussion of wealth. Only numbers on notebook paper. After Liam went upstairs, George checked the mail. One envelope carried no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. Mr. White. You don't know me. My husband worked 34 years in a manufacturing plant that nearly closed twice. He passed away last year. Your article reminded our family that people behind the scenes still fight to keep factories alive. Thank you. No signature. Only initials. MH. George folded the note carefully. He placed it inside the same drawer where he kept old photographs of Liam. Not because the writer praised him, because she understood the purpose of the work. Weeks continued passing. Life settled into a new rhythm. Court hearings disappeared. Reporters called less frequently. Forbes moved on to other stories. Yet George noticed something unexpected. People now watched him constantly. Employees observed how he treated janitors. Investors noticed whether he arrived on time. Young engineers copied his habits during meetings. Visibility had become another responsibility. One Friday afternoon, a junior engineer nervously approached him. Mr. White. George looked up from a production chart. Yes. I wanted to ask something. Go ahead. How did you stay motivated before anyone knew who you were? George thought quietly. The engineer waited. Finally, George answered. I wasn't working for recognition. The young man nodded. But didn't it bother you? George looked across the production floor. Hundreds of people moved through carefully coordinated systems. Machines operated with steady precision. Orders shipped. Families would receive paychecks. Suppliers would remain in business. Small towns would keep their factories. He turned back toward the engineer. The work already mattered. The engineer remained silent. George continued. If something already has value, applause doesn't increase it. The young engineer smiled slowly. I think I understand. George returned to the production chart. I hope so. Late that evening, Andrew called again. I've got one more surprise. George leaned back in his office chair. I'm beginning to worry whenever you say that. Andrew laughed. This one's different. What is it? The Forbes issue just won National Business Feature of the Year. George smiled faintly. Congratulations to Rachel. I already called her. Andrew paused. She asked me to tell you something. What? Andrew repeated Rachel's exact words. The best stories don't create character. They reveal it. George ended the call a few minutes later. Outside his office window, workers changed shifts beneath bright factory lights. One crew finished, another quietly took its place. The machines never stopped. Neither George realized did the opportunity to become the kind of man no headline could improve and no criticism could diminish. Autumn arrived quietly across Illinois. The maple trees lining George's neighborhood shifted from green to deep shades of gold and crimson. Cool air replaced the humid mornings of summer. Nothing about the season announced itself loudly. George appreciated that. Meaningful change rarely did. 6 months had passed since the divorce became final. 5 months had passed since the Forbes cover. 4 months had passed since the courtroom doors closed behind everyone. The headlines had disappeared. The work had not. Every Friday afternoon, George reserved 1 hour on his calendar for something no investor requested and no board member questioned. Factory visits, not executive tours, working visits, no photographers, no speeches, no prepared routes, only conversations. One October afternoon, he drove nearly 3 hours to a small manufacturing plant outside Peoria. The facility employed just over 100 people. Most executives would have considered it insignificant. George disagreed. Every healthy factory strengthened an entire community. Plant manager Steve Callahan met him near the entrance. We're honored you're here. George smiled. I'm here because Andrew said you've reduced equipment downtime by 20%. Steve laughed. I guess he told you the good numbers? I came to understand how. For the next 3 hours, George asked questions few executives normally asked. How often did maintenance technicians walk production lines? Which replacement parts took longest to receive? Which machines frustrated operators the most? Where did quality failures usually begin? The answers filled an entire notebook. At the end of the visit, Steve looked almost embarrassed. I thought you'd be evaluating us. George closed the notebook. I was. Steve waited. George smiled. I also learned from you. The manager shook his head. Most chairmen don't say that. George answered without hesitation. Most chairmen eventually stop improving. On the drive home, George received another call from Rachel Morgan. She had remained in occasional contact since publishing the article. Congratulations, George frowned. For what? You haven't seen today's announcement. I've been driving. Rachel laughed. I should have guessed. What happened? Harvard Business School added your Forbes interview to a leadership case study. George remained silent for a moment. They did. They're teaching it next semester. George almost laughed. They're going to disappoint a lot of students. Why? Leadership usually looks much less exciting than people expect. Rachel smiled through the phone. That's exactly why they're teaching it. They spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. George never imagined university classrooms discussing his career. He also knew nothing about tomorrow's work schedule would change because of it. Monday morning arrived with another challenge. A supplier bankruptcy threatened production schedules across 3 states. Emergency meetings filled the day. Engineers debated alternative sourcing. Financial analysts projected losses. Several executives argued for temporary layoffs. George listened to every proposal before speaking. What problem are we solving? Silence followed. One executive answered, reducing costs. George shook his head. Our problem isn't cost. Another executive looked confused. What is it? Continuity. He walked toward the whiteboard. If we lose skilled employees today, who rebuilds production 6 months from now? Nobody answered immediately. George continued writing. Temporary supplier, shared production capacity, regional partnerships, accelerated inventory transfers. Within 40 minutes, the meeting ended with a completely different plan. No layoffs, no panic, only coordinated adjustments. Angela Morris remained after everyone else left. You know, George looked up. You've become predictable. He smiled. Is that bad? No, she laughed. I've simply noticed something. What? You never solve the problem people bring into the room. George waited. You solve the one hiding underneath it. George considered the observation. My father used to fix tractors. Angela nodded. So, he said broken engines rarely break where the noise comes from. Angela smiled. That explains a lot. Several weeks later, George received another invitation. This one came from Midwest Integrated Manufacturing, the company where he had spent so many ordinary years, their annual employee recognition banquet. The invitation requested that George deliver the closing remarks. He accepted immediately, not because of the audience, because of the location. That company had given him opportunities long before anyone knew his name. The banquet filled a modest conference hall in suburban Chicago. No television cameras waited outside. No national reporters attended, only employees and their families. George preferred it that way. After awards concluded, the plant manager introduced him. The applause lasted much longer than George expected. He stood quietly until the room settled, then approached the podium. I prepared a speech. The audience laughed. I decided not to use it. More laughter followed. George looked across the room. He recognized forklift operators, machine technicians, shipping coordinators, receptionists, people who had shared ordinary workdays with him for years. I've been asked many times what changed after Forbes. He paused. The honest answer is very little. The audience remained completely silent. My alarm still rings before sunrise. A few people smiled. I still solve production problems. Several nodded. I still make mistakes. More smiles appeared. George rested both hands on the podium. The biggest difference isn't in my life. He looked around the room. It's in what people assume when they first meet me. The room stayed quiet. They now expect competence before I've done any work. He paused again. For most of my career, I had to earn that expectation every single day. Nobody moved. George continued. I actually preferred those years. Afterward, many employees formed a line simply to shake his hand. No autographs, no photographs, just conversations. One elderly machinist finally reached the front. I've been here 42 years. George smiled. I know. The man laughed. You remember? You trained me on hydraulic press maintenance. The machinist looked genuinely surprised. You still remember that? George nodded. You taught me something important. What? Measure twice before touching anything expensive. The old machinist laughed so hard tears formed in his eyes. I've been saying that since 1989. It still works. Driving home later that night, George reflected on how easily people misunderstood success. They assumed it arrived with magazine covers, board appointments, court victories, large bank accounts. He knew better. Success had begun years earlier. The first time he chose patience over pride. The first time he verified facts instead of assuming them. The first time he accepted that consistent discipline always outlasted dramatic moments. At home, Liam waited in the living room. "You were late." "I know." "Good speech." George removed his jacket. "I think so." Liam reached beneath the coffee table. "I've got something." He handed George a folded sheet of paper. "My teacher asked us to write about someone we admire." George unfolded it carefully. Across the top, Liam had written, "The strongest person I know." George quietly read every line. Not one sentence mentioned Forbes. Not one sentence mentioned money. Not one sentence mentioned becoming famous. Instead, Liam wrote about mornings before school, homework at the kitchen table, keeping promises, staying calm, listening before speaking, helping people without expecting credit. George finished reading. He looked toward his son. "This is better than any magazine." Liam shrugged. "I just wrote the truth." George folded the paper carefully. Unlike the Forbes issue, this document would never appear in bookstores. No investors would quote it. No journalists would analyze it. Yet George knew exactly which one he would still treasure decades later. Because one had recognized his career. The other had quietly confirmed the man he had hoped to become. Nearly 1 year after the divorce papers first arrived, George stood in the same kitchen where everything had seemed to fall apart. The house looked different now. Not because expensive renovations had transformed it, because peace had returned. The dining table no longer disappeared beneath legal binders. Court calendars had been replaced by Liam's school projects. Financial records had given way to grocery lists and engineering sketches for another science competition. The silence inside the home no longer felt empty. It felt settled. George poured coffee before sunrise, exactly as he always had. Outside, the first snow of winter drifted quietly across the neighborhood. The maple tree in the front yard stood bare now. Another season had completed its work. Liam walked downstairs carrying his backpack. "Morning." "Morning. You working from Chicago today?" George nodded. "Board meeting starts after lunch." Liam smiled. "Can we still get pizza tonight?" George looked up from his coffee. "Friday." "So, we always get pizza on Fridays." Liam grinned. "I just wanted to make sure being important didn't change that." George laughed softly. "It never will." Liam nodded with complete confidence. "I know." After dropping Liam at school, George drove toward Apex Flow's Chicago office. Traffic moved slowly beneath a pale winter sky. His phone remained quiet. No reporters, no emergency legal calls, no endless interview requests. He preferred it that way. Inside the office, the quarterly board meeting began promptly at 1 o'clock. Revenue exceeded projections again. Manufacturing partnerships continued expanding. Employee retention reached record levels. International opportunities appeared on the horizon. After reviewing the final presentation, Andrew closed his laptop. "I think we should finish early." The board members looked surprised. Angela Morris smiled. "That's unusual." Andrew stood. "I'd like everyone to come downstairs." Nobody asked questions. The entire board followed him to the first floor. George immediately noticed dozens of employees gathered near the entrance. Engineers, receptionists, software developers, administrative assistants, warehouse coordinators, maintenance staff, people from nearly every department. A simple banner hung across one wall. 5 years? Built together? George looked toward Andrew. "You planned this?" Andrew smiled. for months. One by one, employees stepped forward, not with expensive gifts, with stories. A customer support representative described how George had answered technical emails personally during the company's earliest years. A software engineer remembered George spending an entire weekend helping solve a production failure instead of attending an executive conference. A warehouse supervisor recalled receiving a handwritten thank you note after suggesting a small improvement that eventually saved millions of dollars. Every story sounded ordinary. Small moments, simple decisions, quiet acts almost forgotten. Together they described something much larger. Not a successful executive, a consistent man. When everyone finished, Andrew handed George a small wooden box. Inside rested the very first notebook George had used during those early meetings in Austin. Its cover showed years of wear, corners bent, pages yellowed. George opened it carefully. The first page contained only one sentence written in black ink. Help people make better decisions. Nothing else. Andrew looked toward him. You wrote that before there was a company. George nodded. I remember. We framed copies for ourselves. George looked surprised. You did? Andrew smiled. Every conference room has one. George slowly closed the notebook. No award could have meant more. Late that afternoon, George stopped by Midwest Integrated Manufacturing before heading home. He wanted to thank the people who had supported him long before the world knew his name. Walking through the familiar warehouse felt almost unchanged. The same machines, the same concrete floors, the same smell of steel and lubricants. Steve, one of the longtime supervisors, spotted him immediately. Chairman White. George smiled. It's still George. Steve laughed. Old habits. Several employees gathered nearby. No formal speeches followed. Only handshakes, stories, laughter. One older maintenance technician finally spoke. You know what impressed me most? George looked toward him. What? You came back. George frowned slightly. I never really left. Exactly. The technician nodded. Most people do. Driving home through falling snow, George reflected on that conversation. Success often tempted people to forget where they started. He believed the opposite. The beginning explained everything worth remembering. That evening, the familiar smell of pizza filled the kitchen. Liam had invited 2 friends over after basketball practice. The boys laughed while arguing over homework and video games. None of them discussed Forbes. None cared about corporate valuations. To them, George was simply Liam's father, exactly as it should be. After dinner, Liam helped clear the table. Dad? Yeah. Our teacher asked us something today. What? What does success look like? George rinsed one plate before answering. What did you say? Liam shrugged. I wasn't sure. George dried his hands with a towel, then pointed toward the living room, the old sofa, bookshelves, family photographs, snow falling quietly outside the window. I think success feels more like this. Liam looked around. This? George nodded. Coming home without pretending to be someone else. Liam smiled. I like that answer. So do I. Later that night, after Liam had gone upstairs, George opened one final envelope waiting on the kitchen counter. There was no business logo, no attorney's letterhead, no magazine branding, only neat handwriting. Mr. White, you spoke at our manufacturing conference 6 months ago. You probably don't remember me. I was the young engineer who asked how you stayed motivated before anyone knew your name. Last week I turned down a higher-paying job because I realized I was chasing recognition instead of meaningful work. I don't know where my career will lead, but I know why I'm building it now. Thank you. George folded the letter carefully. He placed it inside the wooden box beside the old notebook from Apex Flow's earliest days. One reminder of where the journey began. One reminder that it had mattered to someone else. He switched off the kitchen lights before walking toward the staircase. Halfway up, he paused. A framed copy of the Forbes cover still rested on a small shelf in the hallway. It had been a gift from Andrew. George looked at it for only a moment, then continued upstairs. The magazine had recorded 1 month of his life. The courtroom had settled 1 chapter. Neither defined him. The years before either event had done that. Years spent choosing patience over anger, preparation over performance, evidence over accusations, responsibility over recognition. The world had celebrated the cover. George quietly treasured the notebook Liam's school essay, the handwritten letters from strangers, and the peaceful home waiting for him upstairs. Those were the things that remained after headlines faded. Outside snow continued covering the quiet suburban street. Tomorrow morning, George would wake before sunrise. He would make coffee, drive to work, help solve another problem, listen more than he spoke, keep another promise. The routines looked ordinary, they always had. That was the greatest misunderstanding anyone had ever made about George White. People believed extraordinary lives were built in extraordinary moments. His had been built in ordinary days, repeated with uncommon consistency, until the truth became impossible to overlook. The greatest victories in life rarely happen in a courtroom, on the cover of a magazine, or in front of an applauding crowd. They happen quietly, long before anyone notices. They are built in the early mornings when no one is watching, in the difficult decisions where integrity costs more than shortcuts, and in the discipline to let truth speak louder than anger. George's journey reminds us that people may underestimate your silence, mistake your patience for weakness, or judge your future by your present circumstances. But character is never measured by appearances. It is measured by what you continue to do when there is no audience. Success that arrives overnight is often the result of years spent preparing in private. And when the truth is supported by evidence, consistency, and integrity, it no longer needs to fight for attention, it simply stands on its own. Perhaps you've experienced a season where someone doubted you, overlooked your efforts, or believed you would never recover from a setback. If so, remember this story. Your greatest response doesn't have to be louder words or faster revenge. Sometimes the strongest answer is becoming the person they never imagined you could become, while refusing to lose your values along the way. Time has a remarkable way of revealing what emotions try to hide. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated, and what helped you keep moving forward? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about resilience, justice, quiet strength, and unexpected triumphs, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story may remind you once again that the people the world overlooks today often become the ones it cannot ignore tomorrow.